My marriage had always felt stable, secure, built on years of love and trust. My husband was a hardworking man, devoted to his job, constantly striving to provide a better future for us. I admired his dedication, but over time, his career became the center of his world. Late nights at the office turned into weekends away, business trips stretched longer, and our conversations dwindled to short exchanges about responsibilities rather than meaningful moments. I never doubted his love, but I couldn't ignore the quiet loneliness settling in. I filled my days with routines, distractions that kept me busy, but never truly satisfied. The absence of attention, the lack of warmth, created a space between us that neither of us acknowledged. I told myself it was normal, that long-term relationships eventually lose their spark, that it wasn't something to dwell on. Then, out of nowhere, my husband's manager extended an invitation. It was unexpected, catching me off guard in the middle of an otherwise ordinary evening. He framed it as a simple gesture, a dinner to show appreciation for my husband's dedication to the company. His words were polite, professional even, and there was no reason to question his intentions. Still, something about it felt unusual. I hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate. My husband, however, dismissed my concerns without a second thought. He saw no issue with it, encouraging me to accept, saying it was a good opportunity to connect with someone influential in his career. His trust in me was unwavering, his confidence absolute. I should have felt reassured, yet a small voice inside me whispered something I chose to ignore. Eventually, I agreed. It was just dinner, nothing more, a casual evening, a conversation over a meal, something completely harmless. I convinced myself that overthinking it would only make it into something it wasn't. There was no reason to feel uneasy. That night, as I got ready, I looked at my reflection, wondering why I felt a flicker of excitement. It wasn't about the dinner itself, nor was it about the company. It was the idea of being seen, of stepping outside the mundane routine I had grown accustomed to. I told myself it was nothing. I had no idea that a single decision, so seemingly insignificant, would set off a chain of events that would change everything. The moment I stepped into the restaurant, I noticed the difference. This wasn't a casual dinner at a local spot. It was an upscale venue, dimly lit with an air of exclusivity. The kind of place reserved for special occasions, for moments that mattered. The realization sent a quiet ripple of unease through me, but I pushed it aside. It was just dinner, just a conversation. There was nothing to worry about. When he stood to greet me, I finally took a proper look at my husband's manager. He exuded confidence, the kind that came effortlessly, the kind that commanded attention without asking for it. Dressed in a tailored suit, his presence was striking, his demeanor composed yet warm. His handshake was firm, his smile inviting, his eyes assessing in a way that made me feel instantly aware of myself. He led me to the table, pulling out my chair, a gesture so smooth it felt instinctive. I wasn't used to that level of attention. My husband was kind, but he wasn't the type for small gestures or lingering glances. This man, however, made it seem second nature, as if every movement was intentional. Conversation flowed easily. He asked about me, not just the surface-level pleasantries, but real questions. He wanted to know my thoughts, my opinions, my dreams. It felt refreshing, intoxicating even, to have someone so genuinely engaged. He wasn't distracted, wasn't checking his phone, wasn't giving me half-listened responses. He was focused entirely on me. Then came the compliments, subtle at first, carefully woven into the conversation. He spoke about how my husband always talked about me, how he could see why. He mentioned my elegance, my presence, the way I carried myself. His words dripped with admiration, laced with something deeper, something I wasn't sure I wanted to acknowledge. The wine kept coming, glasses refilled before they were empty. I sipped slowly, trying to pace myself, but the warmth had already settled in, blurring the edges of my restraint. My laughter came easier, my walls lowered just enough to let the evening take on a different tone. It was innocent. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The way he looked at me, the way he leaned in just slightly when he spoke, the way his fingertips brushed mine when he handed me the menu. None of it was accidental. I should have walked away then, recognized the danger, and stopped it before it began. But instead, I let the moment linger, let the attention wrap around me like a temptation I wasn't ready to resist. The conversation had started with harmless pleasantries, but as the evening stretched on, something in his tone changed. The words were still smooth, still polished, but there was a new weight to them, something that settled in the air between us. He spoke about success, about ambition, about the sacrifices required to build the kind of life my husband was chasing. But then, his focus shifted to me. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to feel like a secret being shared. He told me I was remarkable, that I carried a presence that was impossible to ignore. He said it with such conviction that I felt it settle inside me, taking root before I could dismiss it as casual flattery. There was something different in the way he spoke, as if he was seeing me, truly seeing me, in a way I hadn't felt in years. I laughed, brushing it off, but even as I did, I felt the warmth creeping through me. My husband's boss had a way of making every word sound deliberate, every compliment feel earned. I wanted to believe it was all just polite conversation, but deep down, I knew better. There was an undercurrent to everything he said, an invitation hidden beneath the charm. The first touch was so subtle, so fleeting, that I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. His fingertips barely brushed mine as he handed me the wine glass, his skin warm against mine for the briefest second. But even that slight contact sent a jolt through me, a sensation that had been absent for far too long. I hesitated, gripping the glass a little tighter, as if grounding myself would silence the thoughts rushing through my mind. He noticed. Of course, he noticed. The slight pause, the way I held my breath for a fraction too long. His lips curled into a knowing smirk, his confidence unwavering. He wasn't just testing boundaries, he was waiting to see if I would push them away or lean in closer. A choice hovered between us, unspoken but undeniable. I should have ended it there, put a distance between us, reminded myself of the life I had, of the husband who trusted me without question. But I didn't move. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the moment linger, letting myself enjoy the attention, the possibility of something I wasn't sure I was ready to admit I wanted. The evening should have ended the moment the check was paid, but neither of us moved. The weight of the conversation, the tension built over lingering glances and careful words, settled between us like an unspoken promise. I knew I should leave, that the smart choice was to thank him for dinner and walk away. But I didn't. Instead, I hesitated, waiting, though I couldn't say for what. He leaned in then, just slightly, closing the space between us in a way that felt deliberate. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he told me something that sent a slow shiver down my spine. I barely heard the words. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, how his breath warmed the space between us, how he spoke as if he already knew what my answer would be. I should have stopped it. Every instinct told me to step back, to remind myself who I was, what I had to lose. But my body betrayed me, drawn in by the quiet intensity of the moment. My breath hitched, my pulse quickened, and in that brief hesitation, everything changed. His lips brushed against mine, not forceful, not demanding, just a quiet test of boundaries neither of us acknowledged, but both of us understood. It was a touch that asked a question, and in my failure to move away, I had already answered it. The kiss deepened, slow at first, then desperate, as if we were both searching for something that had been missing for too long. The rush was immediate, intoxicating. The thrill of something forbidden, the way it ignited a fire I hadn't felt in years. It drowned out the guilt, the reality of what I was doing. For a moment there was only the warmth of his hands against my skin, the pull of his body against mine, the feeling of being desired in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. Then, just as suddenly, the weight of it all crashed down. My mind caught up with my actions, and guilt twisted inside me, sharp and unforgiving. I pulled away, breathless, staring at him with a mix of panic and something I wasn't ready to name. I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, stepped into a place where the consequences would follow me long after this moment ended. And yet, despite the guilt clawing at my chest, one undeniable truth remained. I didn't regret it. The first mistake should have been the last, but instead, it became the beginning of something I couldn't control. The thrill of that night lingered long after I had returned home, settling in my thoughts like an intoxicating secret. Every glance in the mirror, every brush of my husband's hand against mine, every moment of quiet reminded me of what I had done. Yet the guilt was dulled by something stronger, the memory of how it felt to be wanted in a way I hadn't been in years. I told myself it was nothing more than a lapse in judgment, a fleeting moment of weakness that would never happen again, but that lie unraveled the moment he reached out, his message arriving late at night, simple yet heavy with meaning. Thinking about you. 4 words, innocent to anyone else, but to me, they were a dangerous invitation. I could have ignored it, deleted it, pushed away the temptation before it took root, but I didn't. Instead, I replied. What followed was a careful dance, one where neither of us acknowledged the depth of what we were doing, yet both knew exactly where it was heading. Meetings disguised as coincidences, lingering conversations that lasted longer than they should, fleeting touches that left a fire beneath my skin. It wasn't just the secrecy that made it thrilling, it was the fact that I had stepped into something forbidden, something reckless. With every passing day, it became easier to justify. My husband's long hours, his distracted mind, his unwavering trust, I convinced myself that what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. I painted our affair as something separate, something that didn't define me as unfaithful, only as someone who had found something she didn't realize she was missing. Each time we met, the intensity grew, the lines blurred, until there was no distinction between right and wrong. He made me feel alive, like I was someone new, someone unburdened by the predictability of marriage and routine. It was a feeling I had craved, and now that I had tasted it, I couldn't let it go. The guilt never disappeared completely, but it became easier to ignore. I had convinced myself I was in control, that no one would ever find out, that I could have both the life I had built and the secret I refused to give up. But lies are fragile things, and I was already walking on a foundation that wouldn't hold forever. The first sign that my carefully constructed illusion was beginning to crack came unexpectedly. My husband had never been the type to question me, his trust in me absolute, his attention always focused on his career. But something had shifted. His eyes lingered on me a little too long, watching with a quiet scrutiny that hadn't been there before. His questions, once casual and easy to deflect, carried a weight that made my pulse quicken. I could see it in the way he observed me, the way I laughed more easily, the glow in my face, the energy I didn't have before. It was subtle, something only someone who had known me for years would notice. I had been careful, meticulous in my deception, but emotions are harder to conceal than actions. My distraction at home, my sudden change in mood, the way my phone rarely left my hand, it was all adding up in his mind. He started asking small things at first, where I had been, why I had taken longer than usual to get home, who I had been talking to. The casual tone he used didn't fool me. I knew he was searching for something. I lied effortlessly, weaving stories that sounded natural, explanations that gave him no reason to doubt me. But even as I reassured him, I could feel the space between us shifting, a quiet distance growing where there had once been certainty. It wasn't just him, I could feel it everywhere. The thrill that had once been exhilarating now carried an edge of fear. The stolen moments with my husband's manager no longer felt like just an escape. They felt like a ticking bomb waiting to detonate. He sensed it too, though he never said it outright. Instead, his words became sharper, more cautious. He warned me to be careful, told me that people notice things, that secrets don't stay hidden forever. The walls were closing in, What had once been exciting was now suffocating. Every glance over my shoulder, a reminder that I was no longer moving unnoticed. My heartbeat raced at the smallest of things. A text received at the wrong time, a name mentioned too casually, a hesitation in my voice. The lie was becoming harder to manage, slipping through my fingers faster than I could contain it. I told myself I still had control, that no one knew for sure. But deep down, I could feel it. The perfect lie was beginning to fall apart. The moment I had feared arrived in the most ordinary way possible. No dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just a silence that sent ice through my veins. My husband stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me, his expression unreadable. In his hands was my phone, the screen illuminated with a message that should have never been sent. One careless mistake, one moment of distraction, and the entire web of lies I had spun began to unravel. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to grasp at anything that could undo what had already been done. But before I could say a word, I saw it. The pain, the betrayal, the slow realization that the woman he trusted more than anyone had broken him in a way that couldn't be repaired. His shoulders tensed, his hands clenched, yet he remained eerily calm, which was far worse than if he had yelled. "How long?" His voice was steady, devoid of emotion, as if he was forcing himself to stay in control. I hesitated, searching for a response, but nothing felt right. Lying was pointless, yet telling the truth felt like delivering the final blow. The weight of silence stretched between us, thick with all the things that could never be unsaid. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. Was any of it real? The question cut deeper than any accusation could. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the life we had built, the love he thought we shared, the foundation that had now crumbled beneath him. I reached for him instinctively, desperate to bridge the space between us, but he stepped back, his rejection final. The distance was no longer just physical. It was something permanent, something I had created with every selfish decision I had made. I wanted to tell him that I never meant to hurt him, that I didn't plan for any of this to happen. But what difference would it make? The damage was already done. His trust, once unwavering, was shattered, and no words could piece it back together. He turned away, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was forcing himself to walk away when every part of him wanted to demand answers. But there was nothing left to say. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The emptiness that followed was far worse than the moment of discovery. My husband had walked away without another word, leaving behind a silence that was deafening. The house felt colder, the space around me heavier. The absence of his presence was suffocating, a constant reminder of what I had destroyed. The weight of my choices settled in, pressing down on me in a way I could no longer ignore. I had convinced myself for so long that I was in control, that I could manage the deception without consequences. But now I saw the reality. The fantasy I had chased was fleeting, and the cost was far greater than I had ever imagined. The man who once made me feel desired, who whispered words that made my heart race, had already moved on. He had nothing to lose, no life shattered in the wake of this disaster. His messages stopped, his presence disappeared, and just like that, I was nothing more than a mistake he had left behind. The whispers started soon after. People who once greeted me with warmth now turned their heads, their judgment unmistakable. Friends who had stood beside me through everything suddenly had nothing to say. Invitations ceased, conversations ended before they could begin. I was no longer the person they had once respected. I was the woman who had ruined her own marriage, who had been foolish enough to throw away everything for something that never truly mattered. Family was no different. The disappointment in their eyes cut deeper than words ever could. They didn't need to say anything. I could feel the weight of their judgment every time they looked at me. I had brought shame upon myself, and there was no undoing it. Loneliness became my only companion. The nights stretched endlessly, filled with regrets I couldn't escape. Every memory, every stolen moment that once felt exciting now felt hollow. I had thought I was missing something in my marriage, that I deserved more, that I was chasing happiness. But now, standing in the ruins of my choices, I realized that what I had destroyed was far greater than what I had gained. There was no redemption, no fixing what was broken. My husband was gone, the life I had built crumbled, and all that remained was the unbearable truth. I had no one to blame but myself. Regret clung to me like a second skin, impossible to shake no matter how much I tried to push it away. Every moment of silence was filled with thoughts I couldn't escape, memories that played on an endless loop in my mind. I traced back every decision, every reckless choice, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I lost control. But the truth was, it hadn't been one moment. It had been a series of small betrayals, each one leading me further into something I should have never allowed. I had told myself so many lies along the way, convincing myself that what I was doing wasn't real, that it wouldn't hurt anyone as long as it remained hidden. But betrayal never stays a secret. It seeps into everything, poisoning even the parts of life that once felt untouchable. Now, I was left with nothing but the wreckage of what I had done. The house was empty, but it wasn't just the absence of my husband that made it feel that way. It was the loss of everything that once filled it: love, trust, security. The warmth that once existed in our home had been replaced with an unbearable stillness. Every room felt foreign, as if I were trespassing in a life that no longer belonged to me. The bed we had once shared was now too big, the walls too quiet, the silence too loud. I had spent so much time convincing myself that I deserved more, that I was missing something, that I had the right to chase happiness. But now, looking at the emptiness around me, I realized how blind I had been. I hadn't been missing anything. I had destroyed the one person who had truly loved me for someone who never cared at all. He had moved on effortlessly, untouched by the fallout. He had no home to lose, no vows broken, no life shattered. I had been nothing more than a distraction to him, a moment of indulgence that carried no real meaning. But for me, it had cost everything. I had thought the thrill of secrecy was worth the risk. I had believed the rush of being desired was worth the guilt. But now, staring into the void I had created, I understood the truth. Some mistakes cannot be undone, and some losses can never be repaired. Time passed, but the weight of my choices never lifted. Regret became a permanent shadow, following me through every moment, reminding me of all that I had lost. I told myself that eventually the guilt would fade, that life would move forward, and I would find a way to exist beyond the mistakes I had made. But no matter how much I tried to bury the past, it resurfaced in the quiet moments, in the stillness of an empty home, in the silence that once held love. My husband, the man I had once taken for granted, had moved on. I saw glimpses of his new life from a distance, his face lighter, his laughter unburdened, his presence no longer weighed down by the betrayal I had inflicted. He had found happiness elsewhere, a second chance at love that I had taken from myself. There was no anger in him anymore, no resentment, only the quiet acceptance that I had destroyed something we could never rebuild. I wondered if things could have been different, if I had spoken to him about my loneliness instead of searching for validation elsewhere, if I had fought for our marriage instead of seeking excitement in forbidden places, if I had understood that love isn't just about desire, but about choosing each other every single day, even when the passion fades, even when routine settles in. But I had made my choices, and there were no second chances for someone like me. The whispers around me had quieted, but the consequences of my actions never disappeared. People remembered. Friends who once confided in me now kept their distance. The family that had once embraced me now looked at me with quiet disappointment. The world had moved forward, but I remained trapped in the ruins of my decisions, watching from the outside as life continued without me. The man I had risked everything for had long since vanished, leaving me to carry the burden alone. He was never meant to stay, never meant to give me the future I had sacrificed so much for. I had been a fleeting moment for him, while he had become the permanent stain on my life. Some mistakes can be forgiven, some wounds can heal, but there are betrayals so deep, so irreversible, that they become part of who you are. I had thought I was searching for something more, but in the end, all I found was regret. Some mistakes can be fixed, but some, like mine, will follow you forever.